For this video, I thought I'd go back to my Half-Life 2 level that I made over 13 years ago as a student, and this time give really detailed level design feedback on it, as if I was my own lead in a game studio and we were trying to ship it in a real game. As you'll see, while the video works well as a cool student portfolio piece, there's lots of stuff that we could improve and would have to improve if we were trying to do this for real. So the feedback is 14 minutes long, and I talk about 19 different points covering the kinds of things that professional level designers have to think about. I hope it's useful. Here it is.
Attention, community.
So let's start off by thinking about how I'm playing my level in this video. Because in a gameplay video, I can play my level exactly how I intended. But since we're talking about the feedback that I would give if we were trying to ship this in a real game, then we have to think about all the things that could go wrong if we gave it to real players. I find that a simple and useful starting point for this is to imagine 100 or maybe even 1,000 players playing your level. Think about absolutely everything they could do, good and bad, and all the ways that they could break your level or have a bad experience if they do things that you haven't thought of. So for example, the very start of this level. The player starts in a very busy room with 2 little side rooms to the left, a locked door on the right, a giant hole in the ceiling, and finally the one thing that is actually important for the players to see, which are these windows that show the scene of NPCs outside. So if we asked ourselves what would happen if 100 players played the start of this level, I think most of them would miss the scene that we actually want them to see. So here's my suggestion. How about we change the layout so that the room the player starts in has all of these features in for the player to investigate, except for the windows. And then when the player leaves that room, they enter a little corridor where the only thing of interest are these 2 windows that show the scene outside. Another way to improve the clarity and the execution of this scene could be just to make the NPCs stay here until the player comes out to meet them. This means the player could talk to them and we could have some dialogue that sets up the narrative for the level, which is important and a bit lacking at the moment. And then we could all head into the street together, which seems like a much stronger way to get into the action. Here, I think the combat distances are too long, because we're firing at each other from distances that are maybe realistic, but they're not very clear or visually dramatic or good for gameplay. What I would recommend here is moving them closer, so maybe one of them is hiding behind the van on the left, and the other one could be hiding behind a new piece of cover that's even closer to us on the right. This would stop them from being such small targets on screen, and also help keep the player in this position, which is where we want them for now. In the end, it's evident that I designed this space to use the crossbow in, but if you gave this to 100 real players, I think a lot of them would forget they have a crossbow, and they would rush ahead with the SMG and make a mess of what comes next. I'd be really curious to see some players play this section because it's quite cramped and intense, and I think some players would have a hard time. I do like this bit though, where I script the Strider to use its special attack on one of the civilians I'm fighting alongside. It's kind of a little trick that you see in films, where when you introduce a new bad guy or the big villain, you show them doing something that shows just how mean or dangerous they are, and it raises the stakes for the fight. Here's an example from The Incredibles by Pixar, which has always stuck in my mind. Mr. Incredible is searching the jungle for, funnily enough, a giant robot to fight. And this is what happens 5 seconds after he finds it. That's right, they introduced the robot by having him cut Mr. Incredible, which in a light-hearted, family-oriented film like this really means something. It's the first time you see Mr. Incredible and maybe anybody in the film bleed. So it signals to us as an audience that if Mr. Incredible doesn't take this really seriously, he's going to get hurt. And it makes us excited to see what happens next. So that's what I'm doing here, and I still think it's a nice idea and it works well. If we were to change it, I think it would only be to make it even harder for players to miss. A classic level design question that we have to think about all the time is what happens if the player does this? And in this situation right now, I'm wondering this about all kinds of things. For example, I'm wondering what happens if the player runs towards the Strider and underneath its legs. I know that the Strider does have an ability to try and kind of stamp on you and kind of impale you on one of its legs, and it's kind of cool when it happens. But the space it's in right now is kind of small for how huge an enemy it is, and I have a feeling that if the player ran underneath it, it would really struggle with its movement and animation, and it could look really buggy and broken. Another fundamental question here is about player knowledge and how this would affect their choices, and specifically their ability to make informed or intentional choices. because the only way the player can fight this strider is with an RPG, and the player has to run up to the second floor of the building on the right to find one. But how do they know? I've not done anything to indicate that it's there. Maybe one solution for this would be to have some NPCs on the second floor of the building where the RPG is, fire some rockets at the strider, and then script the strider to use its special attack on the building and take them out. The player has quite a good view on that from here, and it could be a good clue that the RPG is inside the building. Whether or not that would be enough is still up in the air, and we'd have to playtest that to be sure. That's me scripting the strider to fire through the window at that point when the player is heading in that direction, and here scripting it to use its special attack against the facade of the building. I like that I set that up so that it was very likely that the strider would also take out the combined soldier with that big laser attack it has. Again, it's me scripting the strider to try and make it look as dangerous as I can, and in this case also showing that it's kind of ruthless and it doesn't care about collateral damage, it's just laser focused on killing Gordon. So as I said in my previous videos about this strider encounter, there's a lot about it that could be improved. For example, the fact that I've put the rocket launcher right next to the ammo for the rocket launcher is kind of a wasted opportunity for easy gameplay. A different way to set this up might be to present the player with just one of these, either the RPG or the ammo for it, at which point they get their confirmation that they're in the right place, but now they have to search for the other part of the puzzle in order to take the strider down. It would just be a nice, simple way of adding a little more gameplay and structure to this encounter, which I think it could do with a bit more of. So my original vision for the actual combat gameplay of this part, where you fight the strider with the RPG, was way more ambitious, but I ran out of time and I didn't manage to finish it. It involved scripting the strider to use its special attack on the facade of the building 3 times throughout the fight, and actually blowing apart the walls, leaving the player with less and less cover to use as they cause damage to the strider. This is a sign that I might not have approached my creative process for this project very well, because the most important part of the level shouldn't be the bit that I ran out of time to do properly. So my bit of advice here for the creative process side of things is to always prototype the most important or complicated or risky stuff in your level early, because this way you minimize the amount of nasty surprises that you might run into near the end of your project. And if time does end up running short, which by the way, it will, hopefully you've got the most important stuff in your level done so that you can scope down the less important stuff and still get things done to a good standard and on time. That moment there where 2 combined soldiers suddenly rushed me as soon as I took out the strider would be absolutely bonkers for real players to deal with. To be clear, I didn't actually script it that way. I think I spawned them outside, and at some point they just decided to chase after me like that. So yeah, definitely something I would recommend changing, because it would be a really unfair surprise that just comes out of nowhere, and just not very good pacing, because the player has finally just managed to destroy the strider, and we should give them some room to feel good about that and cool down a bit, instead of immediately ambushing them by surprise and probably killing them. Here's another example of me playing the level exactly as I intended it to be played, but not in a way that I think most players would at all. I've just looked out the window after destroying the strider and spotted some tiny little ally characters emerging from the underground, and now I'm going to go out and join them. But with real players, I think most of them would have no idea that those NPCs just turned up, because they're so far away and I'm not doing anything to draw attention to them. So I think most players would finish that strider fight just wondering what to do next. It's maybe okay because we're winding down before we transition to the next level, but this final little combat space has all the classic little problems to look out for. It's really huge and open, it's completely flat, the player encounters the enemies from really far away so they're tiny on screen, and there's barely any cover for the player or the enemies to use to create any interesting kind of behavior or dynamics in this fight. So because I'm making this project with the existing content and dialogue from the original game, it's kind of hard for me to tell a brand new story with it. But if this was for a real game, then I think we'd definitely want to get some narrative exposition in here. The beginnings and endings of levels are generally natural places to do this stuff. And especially in this case where we've regrouped with all these rebel characters and we've just had a big fight with the strider and transitioned to the next level. So we could really do with both some time to calm down and also some exposition to progress the story and set us up for what's about to come next. Maybe that NPC could have commented on me taking the items as well. It's nice to acknowledge the player's actions.
Ah, Gordon Freeman.
Let us through!
So I think the idea of this ambush is cool, and the current implementation of it certainly works as a nice surprise, but the way the scene is set up and the build-up to it I think could be much improved, so here are 3 suggestions with that in mind. First of all, like earlier, we've missed a great opportunity here to let the player talk to the characters and get some narrative stuff across. Exchanging a few lines with these characters could also make the nasty surprise even more dramatic. The second thing is that this whole scene is just triggered by the player walking into a trigger volume near the end of the room. This makes the trigger point invisible and quite arbitrary, which could be really confusing for players when they trigger it with no idea what just happened and why there are suddenly explosions going off. And so generally it would be better to trigger this based on an interaction with one of the NPCs, and that way at least we know where the player is stood and what they're focused on, and we can design the scene to be viewed from that perspective. The final thing would be to add a little more time and build up before the actual explosions kick off. A classic thing to do would be to have a little more tense silence, and then have some ominous red beeping lights counting down to the explosion. Just to draw the tension out a little longer and give players a few moments to realise that something's wrong before it kicks off. I'm quite fond of this scene because of how it's both a mix of scripted and emergent elements, and also an example of gameplay and story occurring at the same time. It starts with the player approaching the NPCs in gameplay, which triggers the scripted narrative scene of the ambush and the doors exploding. This is followed by the scripted gameplay thing of the combined soldier throwing the grenade through the doorway, which then leads to a nice little emergent narrative moment of the grenade taking out one of our friends, causing her to throw her weapon in our direction as she dies. At which point I'm able to pick up that weapon and use it against the combine, which is kind of a new gameplay element that comes out of a narrative beat that I didn't even script. And in true Half-Life 2 fashion, this is all without taking control away from the player, which I like. This kind of combination of scripted and emergent and also gameplay and story really cuts to the heart of what I'm passionate about as a level designer. If we were to work on this more, it would be all about improving the setup, making sure that the triggering and the drama of the scene is clear, and that the sequence as a whole works well regardless of how players play it. A little thing to bear in mind here is that this is the only part of the level where both the player and the Combine soldiers have grenades, and I've scripted the Combine to use them. So my main suggestion here is that if this sequence is about grenades to some degree, we know there's going to be grenades going off in this area, it would be a particularly good place to add lots of destructible physics objects like crates and benches and stuff. This would help the explosions feel more destructive and dramatic, and could even change the shape of the playable space, making the fight feel more dynamic and interesting. This area has a bit of a problem with cover and movement options. Ultimately, neither the enemies that the player is fighting or the player themselves have any interesting movement options here. All the player can really do is hide behind this wall on the right and keep popping in and out and shooting from there. So my feedback here would be to try and find ways to add a couple more cover objects for both the player and the NPCs to move between, just to encourage a bit more of a dynamic encounter and for interesting things to happen. Because at the moment everybody is forced to be quite static, except for this one guy coming up who ends up charging the player, which is a bit too intense. Okay, we're getting to the end of the video now, and I'll wrap up by saying that if you're making a level that real people are going to play, you really can't do what I did when I made this level, which is to make the whole thing from start to finish without showing anybody or playtesting it with other people. Because imagine if I got all this feedback. The new problem would be that I got it too late, because the level's finished, and changing anything would be really painful and complicated, which makes getting the feedback kinda useless. So my final point is about how playtesting isn't something you do at the end of your creative process, it's something you do early on and throughout your entire creative process to guide you along the way. And this is finally the end of the video. Cheers for listening if you got this far, and I hope it was useful. See ya.